I made a circle for my cone, and to make the circle, you can either use a protractor or a ruler. So I took my ruler and I have the center of the circle 2 inches from the point. So you want to make a point and then make marks down 2 inches and down 6.5 inches. And I just went all the way around, and every time I pivoted around the point, I made a mark at 2 inches and 6.5 inches. And you want to make sure each time you shift your ruler that you have the point of the circle on the corner of your ruler to make sure that you keep it symmetrical all the way around. So after I made the points, I just connected the points, and I'm using a pencil for the demo so you can see the lines easier. Then I'm going to cut the circle out. And I'm going to use the circle to make the cone. And with the cone, I'm going to show you how to use bias tape, a double fold bias tape, for the edge of fabric to have a really nice edge. This is really great for finishing the inside of a garment or even the exterior of a garment if you want to have a different color or a matching. You can make matching bias tape with your fabric. So I've cut my circle out and I want to divide it into quarters. So before I cut the center circle out, I'm going to go ahead and fold it in half. And then I'm going to iron it. And I have water in my iron, and I'm going to steam the fabric to really get a nice crisp line. So this is nice and ironed. I can see the edge here is a little bit shy on one part. I'm going to open this up. I see that's 6.5. So then it's going to be this other side that's a little bit too big. So I'm just going to trim that down. Okay, I have that ironed. I ironed the crease, and this is a good line for me to cut. I'm just going to iron it open now. And I still have that crease in there that I can use to cut. You could draw a line in half of the circle to divide it. I find it easier just to fold the fabric in half. So now I'm going to do a quarter. So I iron it in half to get a crease. Then iron it open. I'm going to cut half of this, the smaller circle out now. And then I'll cut this in half. So I have 2 quarters that I'm going to sew together, and then I have this extra piece of fabric. If I wanted to make a little cone, I could sew this together. I'm not going to do that right now, but you can see how the scale of cones shifts based on the size of circle that you've used. Before I sew these together, I'm going to make the fabric to go on the inside of the circle. So I'm going to finish this where I cut a piece of fabric that's 1.5 inches longer than each of these half circles. it gets sewn together, and I sew them together right sides together, and then inside out or right side out them, and the top of the edge of your cone will be nice and crisp, and you won't see any type of stitching. You can see if I folded this under to hem the top, you can see this area right here where the fabric is smaller than the rest of the fabric because it's a cone shape. So, and able to finish that, in order to finish that, I'm going to show you one technique. This can also be used for garments for finishing, for the top of a shirt. There are a lot of ways you can apply this to a garment. So I'm just using my ruler to measure 2 inches because I'm going to go down to make sure I have enough fabric here. So I'm going to take my patterns. You don't have to draw that line. I'm just doing that as a guide for myself. So I'm ironing them so they're nice and smooth before I make a pattern. And I'm just going to take this fabric, the one that I've cut, and I'm going to trace it. So I'm tracing the top and the sides. And now I'm going to take my ruler, and just like I did before when I was expanding the patterns, I'm going to measure 1.5 inches down. And I'm going to go all the way around 1.5 inches. So now I'm connecting those lines. And I'm going to do the same for this one. And I'm just using that line that I had used before just to try to save some fabric. So 1.5 inches around, you can see I have the point of my ruler along this curve that I'm following. So I have these 2 pieces. I'm going to cut them out, and then I'll show you how to sew them. So as I start sewing, I'm going to find the right side of the fabric. So this fabric, you can see there's a small diagonal going along the weave of the fabric. So that's the right side of the fabric. The wrong side doesn't have a diagonal on it. So I'm finding the right sides of both. I can see a diagonal on this one. Sometimes it's easier you have a print on one side and not the other. So I want to line these 2 up to each other with right sides together. I'm going to sew a seam along each one of these, and then I'm going to do the same for these larger patterns also. I'm going to sew these 2 together on this side and on this side to make a cone. I'm going to sew the cone. So I'm going to start by sewing the sides of the smaller pieces together first, and then the sides of the larger pieces together. I want to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance And so I measured 1/4 inch from where the needle inserts into the fabric out to the edge of the cloth. And I put down a piece of tape that I'll remove today so I don't get sticky residue on the sewing machine as a guide. So I have my needle inserted into my fabric, sew a couple stitches, back stitch, now I'm going to sew the other side. So I have my needle down, I'm towards the back of the fabric here, and when I back stitch I go all the way back and then stitching over it. I go back and forward at the end. I'm going to trim all of my threads. And now I'm going to sew these larger 1/4 sections together. My needle was down when I put the presser foot. My thread got jammed, so I just got it out of the way. Okay, put my presser foot down, put the needle into the cloth. I want to make sure to lift up my needle. I'm holding onto my thread as I do that so it doesn't come undone. Lift my needle up when I'm done sewing. And cut. Now I'm taking my iron and I'm pressing my seams to one side. And as I press them, I'm making sure not to make a crease on the edge of that cone. So I right side out it. You can see now the seams are on the inside. I'm going to do the same to this cone. And as I iron them, I want to tug a little bit, keep my hand away from the iron, especially when I steam it. But I want to tug to make sure I get that whole seam in there. And I'm ironing both sides to the right, just to keep it consistent. So my seam is ironed to one side, and then I can right side out it. I'm going to go ahead and top stitch on top of the seam in the direction on the side that the seam is folded over into, just to keep that seam in place and to show you how to top stitch. To top stitch, I'm going to put my fabric down, and the presser foot has a hole inside. And I'm going to line the edge of that seam to that outside of that hole inside of the presser foot. And I'm just going to run my stitch all the way down along there. I have to turn the machine on so it's ready to go. Turn the machine on. And I'm still going to back stitch and then go forward. And a top stitch is nice because it secures the seam on the inside. It can also add, and as I get forward, I want to move my fingers out of the way, but it can also add a decorative element or a design element to your piece. So I lift my presser foot up. So you can see here I have a top stitch and it covers that seam on the inside. So that's also makes it more secure. I'm going to do this other side also. I want to make sure my thread's headed towards the back. And I'm moving this fabric out so it's nice and flat where I'm sewing. And I keep my fingers away from this screw that's going up and down with the needle and away from the needle. Now I'm not going to top stitch the smaller one, but I am going to zigzag along the edge of it to help secure the edge, the cut edge of the fabric, because that's not going to be sewn to anything. So I'm putting my presser foot down and I have the edge of the fabric right by the edge of that opening in the presser foot. And then I'm going to change my dial here to C, which is a zigzag. I'm going to start zigzagging, and I'm just going slowly along as to the closest to the edge that I possibly can. So you can see the zigzag stitch here, and I don't want it to be quite so big, so I'm going to change the stitch length. So if you had a serger, you could serge the edge of your cloth, and that just secures all the ends so you don't have frayed fabric on the inside. A serger or overlock machine is a machine, if you look at the seams of the clothes that you bought in the store, they're serged on the end and it keeps the fabric from fraying. And this is a good alternative with a home machine for really securing those edges. And I'm just going to go over it again because I started with a longer stitch and I changed it to a smaller stitch. And you can see I'm just going along with that curve. And I'm using my fingers to guide the fabric. I'm not pushing or pulling. I'm letting the feed dog and the presser foot do all the work. So this is going to be on the inside of the cone, but you can see this fabric here is already starting to fray a little bit, and now that zigzag will prevent it from fraying too far. So now I have my finished cone, or my sewn cone, and then the inside portion, and I want to put them right sides together. So this is the wrong side of the fabric, the right side has that diagonal, and this is the right side of the fabric. So this is what I want to be shown outwards. And I'm just going to take my inside cone, and you can see I'm lining them up so the edges are right along each other. And here you can see the seam is going to the left on the big cone and to the right on the small cone, and I'm really lining them up so that seam meets in the middle. It's nice to have the seams facing opposite directions because then I don't have a lot of bulk there, because right here I have 2 pieces of fabric in the seam plus my small cone and my large cone, so that's 4 pieces of fabric here and 4 pieces on this side. If both of the seams were going to the same direction, I'd be sewing through 8 pieces of fabric, and that can be kind of tricky. So if you want, you can take straight pins and put them in. I just like to hold it together as I go. So I have my seams together and I'm laying them on the bed of the sewing machine. And I'm going to slowly stitch as I pull and maneuver this fabric around. Now I want to go back to my straight stitch, which is letter A, and I'm going to stitch about 2.5 stitch lengths. And I'm keeping it at 1/4 inch, so I'm going right along the edge of the feed dog there. Oh, I didn't put my needle in. You can see my needle just got unthreaded. So I'm gonna have to rethread my machine. That's what happens when you don't stick your needle into the fabric. So now, got my thread and my needle, and the needle is in the fabric. So I'm going to slowly stitch forward and then backward. And something is catching. Okay, so you can see my needle's not going up. So I want to go up and down a little bit and start pulling it, and then I have all this thread here. So likely when my needle became unthreaded, my threads got twisted underneath. So I'm just going to show you how to fix that. So I'm going to go ahead and pull those threads out. So I've cut all the threads out. Now what I want to do is open up this space down here and check that my bobbin, nothing's going on down there. That looks normal. And I tug a little bit on my thread and it's has some tension, but it's still moving. And this is where it's getting caught. As I twist this, it's feeling really tight. So I'm gonna go ahead now and just take everything out and rethread the machine again. So I'm taking the bobbin all the way out of the bobbin casing. Putting that thread back in. Okay, now it's moving better. So that's something you've got to, if you have a problem, it's best just to take everything out and put it back in case there's a string that's in the wrong place, if your thread gets pushed to the wrong place. All right, so I'm going to start sewing. And this is a pretty small opening. So you can see I'm holding these edges together. And I'm slowly moving all this puckered fabric out of the way. So I get to about here where I can't go any further. You want to put the needle down in the fabric so it doesn't shift as you realign everything. And as I'm realigning it, I'm checking to make sure both edges are in line. So I'm trying to flatten the fabric out as much as possible and get both edges in line. I'm sewing on a curve, so there's all this extra fabric that's starting to pull and pucker it. So as I sew, I want to shift the fabric, you can see, along that curve. And if this gets to be too tricky, instead of cutting the first circle 6.5 and 2 inches, you can cut the smaller one 3 inches. It'll give you a bigger opening to work with this. And I'm stopping when my fingers get close to the needle. You don't want to sew through your finger, it hurts. Okay, so I've sewed all the way around the top and these two are together. Before I right side out this, I'm gonna clip the fabric along this selvage or the seam allowance. I don't want to cut into that line that I just sewed. But what I'm doing is, because it's smaller here than it is here, it needs to have some clips so it can lay flat. So I've gone all the way around. And now I'm going to take the iron and I'm going to iron right here where it's sewn together to get a really crisp edge. And I'm going to iron that seam down to that inside. I'm going to iron the seam to the inside of that small piece. So I'm ironing one part, and I'm careful to keep the hot part of the iron away from me. And you can see I'm shifting around and ironing that seam down. And I have steam on my iron to really get a nice crisp edge. So you can see the inside there. It's all ironed where the seam is, and then the outside you can see is right where it's sewn together. So before I put this on the inside, so I have a nice finished edge, I like to look at all the steps of the process. I think as an artist, it's good to stop and look and see what kind of forms you're getting. So you can realize if you're ever trying to sew something that's wide and then it gets smaller and then larger, this is a good way of doing it. So it's a beautiful form just as it is, but we're gonna finish and have a cone. So then what I'm gonna do is I take that smaller cone and I put it on the inside. I'm gonna iron that seam down there. And as I iron, you can see I've got about 1/16 of an inch of this going down inside. So I have a really nice finished edge on the outside. And when you're working with small pieces like this, you want to be really careful to keep your hands away from the hot part of the iron. So I have the edge all ironed. I'm going to open this up, just iron it a little bit more. So now for the top of the cone, I have two options. I can take the sewing machine and top stitch on the outside. What I'm going to do though, instead of that, so I have a nice clean edge, is I'm going to open these up now that they've been ironed. And I'm going to go ahead and top stitch the seam to the inside of this small cone. That's going to hold the seam in place. And when I put it back right side out, you won't see a seam on the outside, but it'll hold the seam and the cone in place. Here's where removing this piece of plastic is helpful. This smaller arm here for sewing is great for sleeves. So if you're trying to open up and expand a piece of fabric as you're sewing that's smaller, you don't have all that plastic in front to work with. So I'm putting my presser foot down, and I'm actually gonna try to line it up right in the middle of that seam. So I'm just paying attention to the seam being right in between the feed dog, the legs of the feed dog there. And one thing I forgot to mention, when you're working with a sewing machine, you don't want water around you or any kind of liquid. So if you're drinking, you want to make sure to have it on a different table. So I'm sewing and I'm moving this fabric out of the way. And going along with the curve. Now if it ever gets to be to the place where it's too hard for me to sew, I feel like the machine goes too fast, I can take the crank and crank it towards me, and this will hand sew basically. You're using the machine and my foot's off the pedal at this time, and I can just move it. Sometimes I do that when I'm going over a bunch of seams and the machine feels like it's having a hard time. I'll just walk it through by hand like that with the crank. And before I shift the fabric, I make sure the needle is down into the fabric. And then back, so I back stitch. So now I can see there's a stitch going all the way around the inside of this cone. So when I right side out it, you can see there's a nice clean finish on the top. And then when I look on the inside, there's a small stitch along the inside, and that holds the fabric in place. So unlike right here where I top stitched it along here and you see that seam, I could do that again where I just put this on the machine and start top stitching it. So I would just sew along the edge, but instead I top stitch the inside to the seam. And that allows me to have an edge without any kind of stitching and hold that fabric in place. I'm going to add bias tape to the edge of the cone. This is 1/2 inch double fold bias tape. So you can see it's one piece of fabric and it's folded in quarters and then in a half. You can see right here, part of it is folded slightly smaller than the other part all the way along. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that part to be on the outside of my cone. And I'll sew it on the inside, and then I'll go along the very edge and it catches the back of the bias tape, and I'll show you those steps. So to figure out how much bias tape I need, I'm going to take a flexible ruler and I'm going to walk it all the way around the cone. So I'm starting at the very edge of that seam, and I'm going to go along with the curve of that cone. And I pinch it and I hold tension as I walk this all the way around. So when I get to a halfway point, it's 9.5. So I'm going to guess that it's going to be 19 inches, as long as my sewing was correct all the way around and consistent. And I'm right there at 19 inches. So you can see this line is right in line with the edge of that cone. So I'm going to cut a piece of bias tape to 19.5 inches. And the reason I'm adding 1/2 inch is that I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to have a 1/4 inch on one side and a 1/4 inch on the other side. So that subtracts 1/2 inch from the total measurement. You always want to make sure to add your seam allowance in. I'm just going to hold this and make sure I have the correct measurement. 19.5. Now I'm going to open this up all the way down and fold right sides together so the fold marks are facing the outside. And I'm going to go ahead and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance to make a ring. Before I do this, I really want to make sure it's not twisted, otherwise I'll have a Mobius strip and it won't work. So I have my bias tape lined up here. I'm sewing at the 1/4 inch. I'm going to push the seam to one side and just refold it. And I'm going to tap that with an iron on the edge here to make sure it's nice and folded. So I've folded this bias tape back so I have this ring, and I iron this area just really quickly to make sure that fold and the seam is flat. Now I'm going to take my bias tape, and I have the edge, the side that's slightly smaller, on the outside of the cone. I'm just going to set this in all the way along the cone. just to make sure it's the right size. See if I have to sew anything else. Okay, so I have this put into place, and now what I'm going to do is take the back of the bias tape and open it. So I'm looking at the front side of the bias tape, and it's open all the way around. So this part is the smaller part of the bias tape. Now I'm going to take, so I have my seam and it's right along the edge of that other seam. I'm going to take my straight pins and I'm going to pin the bias tape all the way along. So I want to make sure to really line that up, the edge of the bias tape to the edge of that fabric. And every inch or two, I'm just going to put a pin in. And you can see I have the balls of the pins facing out or to the right side. You want to be real careful not to poke yourself as you're doing this. And I'm only going through that one layer of bias tape and the one layer of the cone. And because the cone curves out, I really have to shift that bias tape up to make sure I get to the edge. And I have all of my pins secured in a pin cushion, I don't want to have any pins drop on the floor and step on them. So you've got to be really careful with all these sharp objects, keeping them in place. Okay, I have my pins on my cone. Now I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So where that fold is, I'm going to go ahead and sew all the way along that fold there. So I'm going to put I have the feet of my presser foot straddling that ditch. And I put my presser foot down on top of one of these pins. I'm just going to take that pin out now. And you want to have your pin cushion nearby so you can put your pins in as you take them out. So before I start sewing, I put my needle into the fabric. And I'm going to start sewing. I have to remove the pins as I sew. I don't want to sew over them. Some people will sew over them in the hopes that they won't hit the pin. If you hit the pin, you're going to break your needle, and you don't want to break your needle. So I go forward and backwards. And now when I get to this place, I'm just going to take the pin out and I put it into the pin cushion. And I'm going along with the curve. So sewing a curve is a little bit harder than a straight line. And you can see I'm using these hands, both hands, to guide that fabric to go around the curve. The nice thing about pinning your fabric is the presser foot is holding the top layer down and the feed dogs pull the bottom layer. So sometimes the bottom gets pulled faster than the top depending on the thickness of your fabric. And these needles, or the pins, hold the fabric into place so you have less of that difference. As you get going, pull it out as you go. You want to be real careful not to have your hand get in the way of the needle that's going up and down. Going all the way around. So you can see the bias tape has gone all the way around the cone. Now I'm going to fold this over. So I'm folding it over all the way, and I'm just going to iron it just to make sure everything is right in place where it's supposed to be. So you can see there's no stitch mark. The stitch is on the inside of that bias tape. And now I'm going through an ironing before I sew. So every time I cut something or sew something together, I iron it before I sew again because it really puts everything back into place. So now you can see how nice and flat that seam is for sewing. So now I'm going to sew just right on the edge of that bias tape. I'm using red thread to really show you how I'm sewing. But if I didn't want that seam to show or the stitch to show, I would use an off-white thread that matches the color of my fabric, my base fabric. I'm going to zoom in so you can really see. So I have my presser foot, and you can see the edge of the presser foot, and I'm going to use so the edge of the presser foot is right along the edge of that bias tape. So I put my needle down, and you can see I'm going to shift it over just a touch. I'm putting my needle right into the fabric, right by the edge of the bias tape. I don't want to sew onto the bias tape. I want to sew onto the fabric. So I'm going right along the edge of that bias tape there. And then as you get going, you can go a little faster if you're comfortable. My cone got caught on the edge of the sewing machine, so I had to just maneuver that around. So you want to pay attention to where all the fabric is and what it's doing. So now you can see I have my cone, and I've sewed all the way around the edge of the bias tape. And then you can see on the inside that bias tape, because it's a little bit thicker on the inside, the thread catches that bias tape. So you can imagine if I had stitched with an off-white fabric, then you won't see that seam, and the photos I posted have some of those there. And now I'm just going into my cone and I'm trimming all of these random threads. So some are hanging off of things I've sewn, and others just got stuck to the fabric. So here's a cone. And this stitch here that secures the bias tape, so now it's a design element or a decorative element. But there's my first cone. So you're gonna have to make another cone, and it needs to be a different size. It could be pointed more, it could be flat and wider, shorter. So you wanna make a circle, and you can divide the circle up into different segments. It doesn't have to be quarters. So imagine if your circle is a lot bigger and then you divide it into eighths, and so 3/8 of it, it would be much narrower and taller. But here's the first cone and the finishing of it.